and I hear the noon whistle. So again, this is Steve Larson up here at Hoard's Dairyman. We welcome you all that are with us so far this morning. It's a nice group of you, and the number is growing by the minute, actually. And so we're very glad to have you with us for Mike Hutchins' presentation today on today's perspective on grouping strategies. With all the changing dynamics and feed prices and everything, I'm sure there's lots to talk about there. And we want to extend our thanks to the Digistar folks for sponsoring today's webinar. And Mike, I'll just turn it over to you. And Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois. Many of you know him so well, popular speaker, prolific writer, and former extension dairy specialist at the University of Illinois. Mike, take it away.
Well, Steve, very good. Thanks for always your very kind words, and it's great to be back with you on our webinar. Our thanks to Hoard's and our sponsors for allowing us to come to you today. And it's a fun topic, Steve. Basically, we're going to talk about grouping strategies, and really it came from a suggestion from one of our listeners about 4 months ago, and we said, that could be a fun one to talk about here today. Why do we want to talk about that? Well, we're going to try to get a look to see how to find some of those missing dollars. And we talk about missing dollars, meaning that the price of milk's a little weak right now. Price feed's kind of going up. Some of you have probably heard us talk about corn prices going up 20 cents a bushel. So obviously it's going to squeeze a little bit, and grouping is another alternative, what we call finding missing dollars, in terms of how we may look at this strategy at this point. So we're going to cover the next 45 minutes looking at grouping strategies, look at some of the research results, a regrouping of cows, the economics of doing this, and then some lead factor adjustments. And again, Steve, it's an interesting webinar because I think, again, listeners, you're going to form your own opinions. And we do have several. We have 3 questions, so get ready to vote as these come up, because I think it's a fairly controversial topic. I thought I'd go back and see, give you a little information. Steve was willing to share with us the 2011 Hoard survey. You can see that about 60% of the farmers in the United States that are readers of Hoard's Dairyman use TMRs. You can see how that has changed, and you can look at the types of TMR mixers in that survey. I thought that was kind of interesting, about a third at this stage of the game. So certainly when you go to TMRs, the question about grouping quickly comes up. So certainly one approach, if we go to a lot of Illinois meetings, you'll see hands going up because we ask this. One group TMR, pretty popular, pretty easy. There's just one recipe to mix and deliver. You don't have to make a mistake. In other words, putting too much protein supplement or putting an additive pack into the wrong group as far as that goes. Number 3 is huge. A lot of my dairymen talk about this. Some people feed the wrong ration to the wrong group of cows, and that's going to cause some problems. So if the high ration goes to the low group, 2 things are going to happen, and both of them are ugly as far as that goes. Herd size, our average herd size in Illinois is about 130 cows per head. So obviously, getting 4 groups of cows with 140 cows may not be very feasible. It does take time to do the extra feeding. That's a factor. And certainly the ability, if it's the same ration, we can always top it off. Here at the U of I, that's what we do. We have a 1-group TMR, but they feed 3 times a day, and they will top off various bunks as we go through it. Now, there's certainly, why are we going to then challenge you today to talk about multiple TMRs? And here's the popular list, some of this board from colleagues as far as that goes. Economics. Steve already alluded to that at this point with feed costs. Some of you want to go back and listen to Mike Allen's presentation on metabolic changes. We'll just touch on that briefly here today. Body condition scores. Sometimes high-producing cows that don't get pregnant and are having a 16-month calving interval can get pretty porky, as we would say. They really fatten on down on some of these high-group TMRs. A magic word's going to be feed efficiency and protein efficiency. This is going to come back and will be maybe a topic in the future, one of our webinars at this point. And of course, environmental status. We just aren't going to be allowed to get rid of all this extra nitrogen and phosphorus that may be found in a 1-group TMR that cows excrete in their urine and feces. Steve, we thought we'd start by looking at some research review. So you can see our very studious Jersey cow here. I'm not sure that's from the Hoard's Dairyman farm or not, but we will move on at this point. So let's do a quick vote. Get your voting pencils out here. Those of you online, I'm going to give you 4 or 5 choices. Let's find out where the knowledge base is today. So go ahead and vote. Some of you new people, you can vote here. And 1 group of cows, 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups, or 5 groups. We give you about 30 seconds to do your voting here. And we are off and running at this stage of the game. We've got about 40% of the votes in.
Good voting.
Good voting.
Perhaps
We're going quickly at this stage of the
approaching
game.
60%.
Yeah, once we get to 66%, we're in pretty good shape, and the polls were almost there because I think a third of them are Republicans, and they just don't want to vote. So let's go ahead and close that, Jim, if we can. And I guess I need to share this with the group, or do they see this, Jim? Do they see it? They're seeing it as you're seeing it, right? Okay, very good. Thanks, Steve. You can see the popular one is about half the people said 3 groups. Notice 4 groups, 17% said 4 groups. 2 groups, you can see 26%. So obviously you can see multiple groups is the most popular one at this point. I'll give you a clue. 5 or more groups, the research would not support that. More about that in just a minute. So pretty knowledgeable group out here at this stage of the game. Jack Albright at Purdue did some really neat work back in the 1990s and early 2000s. In fact, Rick Grant did some of this work. Some of you recognize that name because he's been on our webinars. And these are all the different factors that affect grouping strategies and number of cows. We already talked about herd size, days in milk, all makes sense. Social interaction, we're going to talk more about that in just a few minutes. So certainly there's a lot of factors that say, should I go to groups and which approach should I use? And we will give you the Hutchins bias at the end of the webinar. But you're going to vote on this pretty much yourself based on some of the information I share with you here in the next few minutes. Let's look at some work that Charlie Sniffen pulled together when he was at Minard Institute a few years ago. Jim did a fun job putting together looking at different cows. So his summary of available research was if you go from 1 Jersey group to 2 Jersey groups, you'd expect to see somewhere around a 1 to 3% increase in fat-corrected milk. If you go from 2 to 3 Jersey groups, you can make those Holsteins or Ayrshires or Brown Swiss if you wish. You'll see about a 2% increase in fat-corrected milk. And you can see going from 3 to 4 groups, you can see about a 1% increase. Most of the study said it's the same ration, and you just simply split those cows up. You'll see why that's an important point a bit later. So already Dr. Sniffen his data would suggest a summary is that once you get up to 3 groups, there may not be a lot of advantage going to multiple groups at this stage of the game. Let's fast forward to a colleague of mine, Dr. Castile in California. He did a survey in California. I thought this was interesting. 2003, then in 2008. I've not seen more recent studies at this point, but you can ask how many rations are they feeding in California? Of course, California's herd size is about 10 times the size of us here in Illinois. So you can see a number of 1 groups. Every one of those dots indicate how many 1 group TMR or 1 rations they would have. You can see by going to 2008, the number of dots rapidly decreased. You can see 3 becomes very, very popular, as does 4. And of course, he being a fairly good researcher, did an R squared. So it says theoretically that the amount of milk, you can see milk, there's a line that goes up, that as you tend to have more groups, you tend to have higher milk production. But just to look at 2008, Steve, and you can see there pretty easily that here we got a herd with 1 group TMR, and they're right up there at 40 kilos of milk. That's 88 pounds of milk. So it doesn't mean that you can't get high production with a 1 group TMR, but it does show some changes that occurred here, and you can also see the R squared goes down a little bit. I'm not sure that is statistically significant, however, but it's interesting to take a look at in terms of another snapshot, another database to consider. I then thought we would look at some older data. You can know it's older because I think, Jim, they see my pointer, do they not? See my pointer? You can see not exactly barn burner production, but it's from Denmark, and this data was in the 1970s. Yeah, I got to go back a ways. We need to do some more research in this area here. You'll see a little bit more here in just a few minutes, but you can see if we have all the heifers and milk cows mixed together, and then you separate them, you can see a significant increase in milk production. This is statistically significant increase, almost 10% more milk by separating the heifers out rather than leaving them mixed with the old cows. So not a big surprise. The other thing that you and I should look at is some social changes. Look at the lying down time. You can look at eating minutes per day. You can look at so these cows behave differently when they're by themselves and when they're mixed in with those great big brutes, as we'd say, those older cows out there in the herd. We then go to Michigan State. This is some work done in the 1990s with Rick Dato and Dr. Mike Allen at Michigan up there, and shows some of the same things that the previous data, but it's newer data. It simply shows, again, that certainly the eating pattern in heifers is different than cows. So when you and I mix those together, we kind of force the heifers to adjust and to change. So again, you can see you can see milk production in back in the 1990s in this study here, 83 pounds of milk for the older cows, about 63 for the heifers. That's a pretty good relationship. That number should be about 75. If you take 75% of the cow data, you should have the heifer's milk yield or performance, and this number is pretty close. But again, I think the take-home message for our listeners is that heifers behave differently when they are amongst themselves rather than mixed in with all the other cows in the herd. Well, I mentioned a bit earlier, Mike Allen looks at grouping, another approach, and simply says that there's a metabolic factor. I think this is some beautiful data. And like I said earlier, go back and listen to it. He gave us a whole webinar on this back in 2012. But he says if you've got high-producing cows, certainly metabolically, the ration has different challenges than when you have low-producing cows. And so he says in high-producing cows, gut fill slows down intake, where in low-producing cows, the fermentation, how fast that feed ferments will impact the intake on these cows at this point. Notice the difference on glucose, insulin sensitivity, and levels of BST. So certainly a different kind of cow metabolically. So you and I start building rations and grouping cows, we should remember this pretty important message. It makes a difference. Now, you may ask, well, what does that mean, Hutchins, at the dairy farm? And so I looked at his data, and I just pulled this out, and I biased it a little bit with a Hutchins swag to it. But it would say on high-producing cows, you would probably have a little higher starch and a little higher concentrate level in the feeding program. You'd use your best forages, your highest NDFDs. For some of us, that would be like brown midrib corn silage would fit here better than over here. You'd feed a little more fat to these cows because they have a demand out here in terms of insulin responses as well. And this is one that I would probably change. It says lower amounts of byproducts, primarily because I'm sure he's looking at NDFs coming in. Usually you look at soy hulls and beet pulp, and we all know citrus pulp. These are wonderful feeds as long as you feed them in moderation and balance them off. But the point is, take a look. And so if we're going to build a low group ration, we would look at different feed ingredients and different levels of feed out there in the program. So again, Steve, I think that's a very important take-home message if you're starring, if you print these off a bit later, an important one to be thinking about. So now we're going to switch gears quickly. Had I been a live meeting, we'd take questions from you at this point. But I think the message is that our cows are different in terms of metabolic, and our age and parity of cows are really big factors that you and I need to be thinking about out here in the program. So what about regrouping, reshuffling the deck? And of course, our Wisconsin veterinary colleagues have done some pretty neat work on dry cows. And so here we go again, Steve, a chance to vote. And so it says, if I move a cow from pen A to pen B, would we expect to see no milk drop? Would you expect to see 1 to 3 pounds to last for 2 or 3 days? Would you expect to see 1 to 3 pounds permanently? These cows just literally drop permanently. Or do you think that a drop is even bigger, up to 4 to 6 pounds? Or are you a liberal and say, well, geez, I think 6 pounds is pretty small. So we're off and running at this stage of the game, and we've got some voters jumping in here pretty quickly. We see a very popular answer coming up. I will not bias the data at this stage of the game, but now there's a recovery.
One popular answer that's showing up there, isn't it? So it'll be
yeah,
interesting to see.
but it's kind of like the Obama. It's the big edge, and we're losing a little edge. We're diluting out here a little bit at this stage of the game. Well, 63% of the vote in. Let's go ahead and close the poll. We're can't be dilly-dallying here, and Jim's going to bring it up to us. And lo and behold, you can see 15% of you say no. If you do it right, there's no milk drop. They could be right. You'll see why in just a few minutes. The most popular number that was running over 50%, but then lost favor at some of the later voters, is 1 to 3 pounds for only 2 or 3 days. And then you can see the rest of the numbers are pretty popular. Nobody voted for the big drop. There is data to support all 4 of those top 4 answers, and you'll see that pop up here in just a minute. Here we go. Let's look at some work in the British Columbia group, and we may have one of these folks on the webinar in 2013. I think you'll enjoy them, looking at regrouping efforts. What they did is a little different, but it's carefully controlled research. They had 4 pens of 11 mid-lactation cows. Now, I think that's important to note. 11, relatively small number, and mid-lactation Holstein cows, and each pen they would add a focus cow. A focus cow is a cow that's been added to the pen, and they followed what happened to her at this point. These focus cows, and I think this refers to all the cows, including the focus cows, you can see that they are second in 2.3 lactations, 150 days of milk, and pretty good milk production, averaging about 43 kilos. That's a lot of milk at this point. They monitored 3 days before they put the focus cow in, 3 days after they added 1 cow to the pen of 11. TMRs are fed twice a day, and you can kind of see what the politics were in terms of loading the freestall and the bunk size. And that becomes important, as some of these mid-lactation cows will not enjoy 1 stall per cow. So here's what happened, Steve. Pretty interesting, I thought. About an 8-pound drop in milk production. That's almost 4 kilograms. And these cows recovered in 3 days. They got that milk back. So one of the popular answers, here's the data you'd be looking at. Here you can see these cows spent 15 minutes less eating time. Displacements, meaning the cow was run out a number of times when we added this extra cow. Here's we reshuffle you might say, the cows out there. We changed the social pattern a little bit, both in terms of lying down and also grooming. So obviously these cows were stressed, you might call it. They certainly had changed their behavior out here in the feeding program. So that's interesting data. I had Travis Michael, who was our herdsman here at the University of Illinois. I asked him if he could go back, because we have daily milk weights. So I said, can you take the last number of cows? And he took 11 cows, and these cows are moved from the tie stalls barn. That's basically where the fresh cows end up in tie stalls. Therefore, you can monitor such things as uterine discharge, feed appetite. You can do body temps pretty easily here. We move them out into the group pens when he deemed these cows were healthy. So you can see these cows are averaging 106 pounds of milk. The day of move, I have no explanation. They've got to be a bunch of Democrats. All I know is the day of move, the data says, and you're going to see it graphically here in just a minute. Jim did that for me. They went up in milk production the day of move. That's a bit surprising. But now you can see basically 3 and 6 days later, we didn't get that milk back. These cows lost about 2 pounds of milk, and we didn't get it back in the first 6 days. And we probably should have followed these cows a little bit closer. Let's take a look. Here's a graphic representation from that. You can see again that this big blip up here, and I am not quite sure how to explain that, Steve. We'll let you answer all those questions there, or somebody may want to chime in. Somebody say, well, they ate more dry matter. Well, yeah, but I don't think I'd see it the same day they moved that they ate more dry matter and get more milk. Maybe a day or two later, but we'll move on. We then took a look at these cows. Here are the 6 highest producing cows. Steve, a very busy slide, but you can see if we pick this cow here, and day of move, she's at 65 kilos of milk. Then she dropped to 60. She's at 60, and she's down at 58. The only weird cow sits right down here, and I saw her last night practicing, and Jim, here she is, number 124. Notice that she was at 56, and now she's up at 60. Now she's at 63. She's at 65. So she just flourished after the move at this point. And this could be dry matter. This could be dry matter, actually, on a cow like that. So again, Jim did the graphics on it, and you can see there's the weird cow, or the unusual cow, green. Jim did an average of the 6 cows, and you can see with her bias coming in, we see a little bit of drop off here, but not a great deal. We then looked at the low cows. The 5 low cows, and notice our numbers are pretty modest, but you can see again that most of my low cows did quite well. They hung pretty much in there. So it looks like the high cows, and this usually was about 2 or 3 weeks after calving, gives you a little idea about when these cows moved out of the fresh cow pen, depending on how healthy they are at this stage of the game. And again, here is another graphic that Jim put together. If some of you like to look at graphics at this, and you can see the red line doesn't change a great deal, but there is a little drop off right here at this stage. Not enough cows at this point. Take home message for some of you dairymen and dairy wives and dairy managers who have milk recording information: repeat this study. Go home this afternoon or go back to your PC Dart and send it to me, and go back and look at your last 20 or 30 cows that you moved and tell me what happened in the first week or so after moving these cows. And Steve, I don't know if do you have daily milk weights at your herd?
Yes, we do.
Hordes?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Boy, a great assignment for a retired guy like Steve Larson to go back and look and see what those jerseys did, and when you did some moving. I think this would be really neat information. It'd be really real world. So I guess, Steve, if we get that done, we may want to bring that to one of our webinars.
All right.
So he's writing that down, but I think it'd be very helpful. I thought I had 2 or 3 Michigan farmers to do this, but obviously they got too busy and didn't follow up on it. But this would be pretty useful, I think, to none of us here on the webinars here today. Here are a couple other studies I would relate to you. I didn't bother you with all the data. This is some work that Dr. Sid Spar, who unfortunately passed away fairly early after he retired, but their data in the Illinois data says move cows before maximum dry matter is achieved. So some of you said, that I think 14% of you said, well, if you do it right, they don't drop in milk. The Israeli and Illinois data says if you do it before the cow's peak in dry matter intake, you'll probably get away with that. And I know the Israeli data was using 82 to 84 pounds of milk back when they did the study. So any cow that was below, a mature cow was below 82 pounds of milk, she stayed in the high group. Any cow below that target number, she went to a lower group number. And they look at feed costs. You're going to see that here in just a second, and you could justify that. There was also another Danish study that paralleled the one I saw you earlier, and what they did is they moved cows from one group to another, but they never changed the ration. In one case, they stepped the ration up. In one case, they stepped the ration down in terms of nutrient concentrations. What I found interesting was when they just moved the cows, they lost about 2 kilos to 3 kilos or 4 to 7 pounds of milk, and they never got it back. So some of you that said, that 4 to 6 pound of milk drop, that's the database you would use. So I guess, Steve, that's always the fun. Liars never figure, but figures always. Figures never lie, but liars always figure. We'll get it right. Yeah, Jim Bolts thinks that's really funny. When you get old, Jim, you too will have trouble with some of those neat terms. But the point is, lots of interesting data to look at, and you can answer that question a couple different ways depending on which database you really want to take a look at. So let's summarize this part of the presentation on regrouping. It looks like, and the Wisconsin people would tend to agree with us, 3 to 7 days for social stability to come back, and this is critical in dry transition and fresh cow groups. That's another story for another day that maybe we'll have Ken Nordland talk about sometime. Moving larger numbers of cows, this is some work that comes from Alabama. Rather than moving just 1 cow, maybe moving 2 to 3 to 4 cows, and moving them probably at milking time, so they come out of the parlor, they go to the feed bunk, and you don't find the new kid on the block. If you move this cow 3 to 4 hours after they've been fed, cows tend to be found pretty quickly that they're kind of the new cow in the lot. With more regular moves, probably less problems. Adequate bunk space, avoid overcrowding, especially in heifer pens. High producing pens important. My thumb rule is you could expect anywhere from a 2 to 4% drop in milk yield due to the social impact. And remember that here in just a minute. And obviously, pretty straightforward. First lactation cows in a separate group. I think the data is pretty clear on that one at this point. Well, let's move forward. We're in good shape here. We're about 3 minutes ahead of schedule, Steve. Let's talk about the economics of grouping. And of course, eventually this becomes a big factor. We talked about metabolic, metabolism of cows, change in milk production, and we talked about age and parity of cows. Let's look at grouping. So we're going to look at it at 2 different approaches. 3 weeks ago, I built 3 rations here using Spartan 3. An early lactation, a mid lactation, and a late lactation cow. I was targeting 85 pounds of milk, 75 pounds of milk. Notice I didn't quite get there, and 40 pounds of milk. Notice the high lactation ration, I've got bicarb in there, so I have an additive in there, bicarb. For some of you, you'd have other things in there. I have no amino acids in there. That'd be another important factor. A blood meal was in there. A heat-treated soybean meal was also in that group as well. When I went to the mid-lactation cows, those 3 ingredients fell out of the solution. I said, I don't think I need them at this stage of the game. Same thing applies to the low group. So these are Hutchins rations built 1,400-pound Holstein cows, 3.7 butter fat, 3.1% true protein. I built those rations. So here are some the numbers, and you may want to write these down because it helps you to see through this in just a minute. 85-pound cows, you can see my feed cost was $6 and roughly 60 cents per cow per day. Here's my dry matter intake and cost per pound of dry matter, and that's an interesting number, 13.2%. Now remember, I'm using gluten distiller, so I'm really working these numbers here. Do not reflect the new corn prices that Steve and I talked about a bit earlier. Notice a difference of 2 cents here when I go to the 76 or 75 pound ration. Notice a difference here on price, about $1 or $1.50. Less dry matter these cows eat. We'll talk more about that in a second, but 2 cents per pound of dry matter less. That's big, Steve. That is really, really big. And that's something you and I really will want to think about when we get at the end of the webinar. Some people want to maybe argue with me on it. Then I get down here to the 40-pound ration. Again, you can see I shaved off another half a cent per pound of dry matter. The big difference here, of course, is blood meal, heat-treated soy, feed additives, and that number, my guess, would be up around 14.5 if I put all the bells and whistles in and ran it. But these are supposedly balanced rations using Spartan. Now, we're going to slow down a bit so we don't get totally confused, including me. Let's look at the economics of an 85-pound group versus if I split them into a 85 and a 75-pound TMR. Yeah, it should be 76, but we'll call it 75. If you look at just the gross savings, and that was in the previous slide, that's $1.53. That's an awfully big number. But one of my colleagues several years ago wrote a wonderful column in Hoard's Dairyman that said, but remember, these cows ate less dry matter. Remember, these cows were eating 49 pounds of dry matter. Now we're at 47. 43 pounds of dry matter. So here sits that 2 cents. So remember, my real cost is because they don't eat as much dry matter. So I really have my cost is now 86 cents. I worked through that last night, and you can see it pops up right about here. Right about here is where that 86 cents. So that is my potential savings, about 80 cents a cow a day. About half the value here. So that's still a big number. Still a big number, and Jim Baltz is looking at this carefully, so he's not frowning yet. But here comes the big one. If my cows drop 4 pounds, and milk price is 19 cents a pound, and for some of you that number is too low, but I think that's where we're going to be in January of 2013, unfortunately, here in Illinois. Here's 76 cents loss. So you could look at this and say, did I save any money 96 by moving them? Not a big difference. Might be a dime there at this point. Now remember, when I moved them to this lower group, I didn't look at age for heifers. I didn't look at RBST, which is used some parts of the country. I didn't consider body condition changes either as a plus or a minus. Looking back in the Mike Allen work. So that's pretty interesting. You could argue, is it worth 10 cents a cow a day? If I got 120 cows in Illinois, I might really think about that, Steve, a little bit. If I've got 1,000 cows or 3,000 cows in California, 10 cents a day is a big number. Big number as far as that goes. And remember, I was pretty conservative in building my high cow ration as well. So now I said, well, what about going from a mid to low lactation ration? And so I did that same philosophy. If you look at the raw numbers, the saving is $1.25. But remember, that difference in dry matter is only about half a cent. So really, when you adjust for dry matters, there's 18 cents laying on the table. 18 cents laying on the table. If I come down here and say, well, if I lose 2 pounds of milk, well, only the Democrats can do this, save 18 cents and charge 38. So not a real smart move. Now, if I go back and look at the high versus the low cow group, I get rid of the 76-pound level, which may happen on some farms. Now you can see I got a much bigger number popping out at me as well. So study these numbers. I went through these 3 times. Jim Baltz gives me a thumbs up, so that means, if nothing else, he's making the same mistake as I'm making. But this is a powerful tool that any of you that are consultants should be working with on dairy farms. If you were consulting for me, I would demand that. I would expect to say, what is my cost and what is my relationship to milk performance out here that I'd be looking at. Now, some of you say, well, Hutchins, that's way too complicated. Well, I want to show you Victor Cabrera's program. And he's not going to talk about this next month, but you're going to hear this young man from Wisconsin talk about one of his software programs called Grouping Software Program. And so here, you're the driver. You can look at one group versus 2, 3, or 4. You can actually do this. You can download your DHI data, which includes milk yield, components, days in milk, lactation or age, parity, and body weight, because he says we will group your cows using your data. What a powerful tool. You will also put in the current price of energy and protein, either by using corn or soybean meal, or if you're using a software program, you know that number, but you enter that because we're going to put in feed costs, and you'll put the current price of milk in. That's going to be really important. Obviously, you saw that in the last example. So when you're asking to run this program, you're going to have to do this. You have to enter this lost milk per cow in how many days. And already we told you this is controversial. So if you put in 2 pounds for 3 days based on the BC work or Illinois data, 2 pounds for 7 days or longer, or some of you voted this is forever, well, you've got to put that in. That's a big factor. There's a place to put in what does it cost to mix more rations. And that will be kind of a swag number. He gives you some guidelines on that. But obviously, if you're going to mix 2 or 3 rations a day, that person and that mixer and that equipment is going to be used more extensively. You can also have some savings on feed additives, just what I did in my ration here. Then he has 4 options to grouping cows. This happens automatically. You don't have any choice. So he's using income over feed cost adjusted for these factors up here. He calls that net return. You'll see that pop up here in just a minute. Now he has 4 ways of looking at cows. He calls them cluster. And by the way, he's got a wonderful paper on his website. You just click on it and you can read all this stuff based on some presentations he had. Cluster means cows with similar energy and protein needs. Now, dairy merit, which looks at milk yield and a body weight correction for the at the 3/4 power. So this is how you would use it in NRC. So he's using something called dairy merit. Fat corrected milk, which means milk production, and then days in milk, which is fairly popular as well. So let's take a quick look, and we got some questions coming in, and that's always good to see. We just keep going, though. Some of you new people on the block, I'll get a little close to the microphone because I tend to back away from time. So, Jim, hopefully we don't bounce you out too loudly here. So I'm just going to show you some results. I thought this was eye-opening, folks out there. I'm using the cluster approach, and I'll tell you why it's the best one. More about that in just a second. I'm going to look at 4 lactating groups. So I took his sample herd of 470 cows, and I said I would distribute them 120, 120, 120, 110. Let me tell you, folks, that's important. You're going to see how you distribute your cows is important. So now, all of a sudden, this grouping thing gets to be very challenging at this point. Now, I find this interesting. This would be the 4 rations you would mix. Notice the protein content comes down from 16.5, which is a pretty nice number, down to 13.2, based on the cows in that group to meet their requirements. And here's your energy, 0.73 mcals down to 0.62. So you can see a dramatic difference in what type of rations you'd be putting together for these 4 groups of cows. So let's take a look at some of the economic impact on that using his net merit number, and you'll see that number pop up here a little bit clearer. I went from 1 to 2 groups, 470 cows. Pretty good milk production, typical good high-producing herd in Wisconsin. By the way, Victor also went to 30 farms in Wisconsin and tested this out. So big factor, big factor. There was $27,000 laying on the table by going from 1 group to 2 group. If you went from 1 group to 4, then there was over $100,000 more net merit income, even paying for lost milk and paying for the extra time of group feeding, of developing these rations. I thought I would ask this question, Jim. I said, what if I went from 300 in the high group, I went to a 2 group? You can spend hours with this program. Trust me, I spent a Saturday afternoon. It should have been when we played Wisconsin basketball. I wouldn't have missed anything important that afternoon. But anyway, I played the wet for hours. 300 in the high group, 170 in the low group. This was the savings. If I went with 100 to 370, notice I just split them up differently. Notice there's a difference of $13,000 sitting here. here, not quite $13,000. If I split them exactly 50-50, you can see I come very close, and these cows with this herd with two groups, it looked like this, well, you could argue $3, how important that $3 is, but you can see that either one of these were the better way of going at this point. So then we looked at the two group, if I did just two groups versus four groups, and now you can see there is $80,000 roughly laying on the table, going from two groups to four groups. And then I looked at his four approaches. Here's this cluster. So it's the same data, the same grouping pattern, which I think was the 100, 100, 100, and 120, 120, 120, and 110, but I'm getting old and senile, away we go. But notice again, you can see the cluster one has the highest number at this point. Dairy merit would come in too, but this will vary depending on your herd, your production, all those kinds of things at this point. There is a box you can click for first lactation, so they will pull these cows out and put them all in one group. Now I'm going to give you two screen captures that Jim Baltz did for me, and the data may not exactly match up, but it's pretty close. Here is no grouping, and here's the net. This is the yearly net return. This is income over feed cost adjusted for those three factors. You'll see that on this. This is per herd. So you can see here somewhere's around $130,000, pretty close to my number. Here you can see cluster, and here you can see dairy merit. So I'm pretty sure, Jim, it's the same database. Jim ran those a little different time than when I ran them, and anyway, you can see that this comes out on every one of your outputs. Here is all the busy work, and it's just a whole class of grouping right here. So here sits my cluster. Here's my four groups. Here are my cow numbers. Here are my four rations. Here's my income over feed cost. This is what it costs to mix feed with my inputs, about 9 cents, almost 10, 8.5 cents per cow per day to mix feeds. Lost milk is going to cost me about 2 cents. I went 2 pounds for 7 days. That's pretty conservative. And then this is my savings. I have almost 80 cents on my feed additives. I specified all those. I drive that. That's my data. No research behind that. Here you can see the numbers over here. Now, if you check the heifer box, you would then click over here and you would tell you which cows you would put in each of those groups. So Victor already tells you which cows you'd put in, for example, in the high group cluster, this third group cluster, and then of course if one of those groups was the first lactation animals, you'd click on that and then you'd see which one of those groups would be your first lactation animals. So that's the only way you can see that. I sent Dr. Cabrero a note over the weekend saying, if I did that, would it pop up here? And the answer is no. You discover that by clicking on which animals, and you'd see that very quickly. One of these groups would be all first lactation animals. Pretty neat output. Pretty neat output as far as that goes. So here's your bottom line. I think it's a fascinating tool. We are going to use it in teaching classes. Here's where you go. You'll end up going to Victor's website. You click on feeding, and then you click on group strategies. He has a number of different programs. You'll see more about that next month at this point. And this is the sheet that's going to come up. This is what you should get. So if you follow the directions here, Jim, we should come up to this website, and away we go, and that's what it looks like. Well, let's start wrapping up here. We're getting close to the end here. Lead factors. Another important thing in grouping cows, and you group cows. 4 different approaches that you can find in the literature. Virginia Tech looked at that, and I rounded the numbers off. It says that if you have one group, your lead factor is 30%. Now I'm going to show you those numbers right now, because I think it'll come. I think I can make it come back and forth. One group 30% lead factor, 2 groups 20% lead factor, 3 groups 10% lead factor. What do we mean by that? I'm going to take this magical mythical herd of 70 pounds, and that's a lot of herds in the United States. Will be 70 pounds if they're black and white. A 30% lead factor says I'm going to feed for 21 pounds above the base. And Mike, if you did your math right, that would be 70 instead of 60. I thought I got all those errors. I found 6 of them last night. And here's number 7. Anyway, you'd be balancing for 91 pounds of milk. So excuse senility, senioritis, whatever you want to call it, Steve. This should be 70. So you'd balance for 91 pounds of milk. Obviously, that'd be somewhere in around 40 kilos of milk. If I take that same 70-pound herd average and I do an 80-pound group and a 50-pound group of milk, apply the feed factors, my high group, now I got the numbers right, I'd be balanced for 96 and 60 pounds of milk. Pretty close to what my example I showed you a bit earlier as well. If I went to 3 groups, 90, 70, and 50, you can see now that my high group be balanced for 100 pounds of milk, my middle group for 77 pounds of milk, my low group for 55 pounds of milk, and that kind of mirrors a little bit. Now notice I have nothing in here for heifers. These are taking the mature second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth lactation cows and splitting them up a little differently at this point. You can see where the economies of feed costs can really become a factor with today's milk price and today's feed prices we're facing out there as well, Steve. Now let's go back here. Take a look. Cornell, Larry Chase presented this at a seminar several years ago. 1 standard deviation above the group. So it says, well, how big a range do you have? And so he said that standard deviation, and Victor Cabrera recommends this in his anywhere from 8 to 17 pounds. Obviously, a 17-pound lead factor would be a herd that might have a cows giving, in the high group, 180 pounds of milk to, say, 80 pounds of milk. You have a much bigger standard deviation than if all your cows were somewhere between 80 and 120 pounds of milk, for example. Jerry Sternagel gave me this number several years ago at Minnesota. Add 12 pounds. That was the DHIA standard herd average for Minnesota Holstein cows back in the 1980s at this point. So again, another interesting number. This is a number we look at the NRC. If you got a heifer cow growth, you better add on 6 or 7 pounds of milk or about 3 kilograms because these heifers are still growing. So a heifer giving 80 pounds of milk needs more nutrients than a mature cow giving 80 pounds of milk, and that basically is NRC. So that's another way to look at lead factors out there on the program. The last thing we're going to talk about here, and we're in good shape, and that's waybacks and shrink when we look at grouping cows. And we've updated these numbers a little bit to reflect, I would say, less than 2% of the total dry matter as wayback, which means that if my cows are eating 50 pounds of dry matter, I would have about a pound wayback. And that's because dry matter is costing 14 cents a pound of dry matter. I can't afford to waste that or maybe not get that to the intended group. Now, if the wayback is more than 5%, and this comes from Fair Oaks Dairy, then it's got to go back to milk cows. What they did back in several years ago, they would take those waybacks, put that in a lower production group as an honest to good feed ingredients, and then balance around that at this point. In some cases, this wayback goes back to steers, as it does here at the University of Illinois, because their concerns on the cleanliness and yonis on the cows, and that makes really expensive steer feed. By the way, the steers love it. The steers do really well on that as far as that goes. Another one of waybacks, if you can top off, simply says that when you go back to the feed bunk, let's say you fed at 6 o'clock this morning, you go back at noon, you want to make sure you have at least 50% of the feed available for the cows for the rest of the day. So some pens may need more topping off than other pens at this point. If you're going to go to looking at waybacks, do a TMR, Penn State box on it, excuse me, I meant to say a Penn State box, and shake it out. And if you have more than a increase of 5% in either of the boxes. If you're using a 3 or 4 box system, it indicates sorting is occurring, and that's going to be a problem. You probably have to bump this number up a little bit higher if the cows are sorting it pretty hard, especially the high cows and the heifers, because they're getting a very poor available ration for the rest of the day, especially in the last, say, 6 hours as far as that goes. Ideally, the work out of Michigan says you should remove this every day. In other words, it should be pushed out. Now, if you're feeding to an empty bunk, you don't have to push anything out. There would be some evidence of maybe doing after each feeding. This is some of the work that Rick Dato did and Mike Allen did when they pushed it out after each feeding. They had a little more intake with fresh feeds, perhaps a little bit like the old buffet that you and I go to. You always got to have a clean plate when you go back. You can look at feed stability using propionic acid or some other organic acids that are out there, but you could also look at the time of year we're working with this point, and that's another factor on waybacks. And then, of course, we can add some water. And again, typically we recommend adding 7 pounds of water initially to see if it increases dry matter intake, reduces feed sorting, and reduces the wayback. Be well aware, especially in summer, water reduces stability of the TMR out there in the summer heat and exposure. So now, some of you out there are going to go to empty bunks, and we were going to ask this question if you'd recommend that. We do have one more quiz question coming up here in a second. I would argue that if you feed to an empty bunk, and one of my best herds in Illinois does that, just drives me nuts. Anyway, it says the cow should have feed unsorted, meaning it shouldn't look at the original TMR within 30 minutes before going to the milking parlor or the next batch of feed is dropped in front of them. They can't be out of feed for more than 30 minutes. Some of you may want to go for an hour. There isn't a lot of research to back that up. Another one of research study for Minard Institute and British Columbia to do. Read the bunks, be it scoring them 1, 2, or 3. If you got 1%, 2%, 3% left over 1 hour before feeding. I picked this up at Saudi Arabia, and then one man, that's all he did is ride around in a gator reading feed bunks for 9,000 cows, and if a bunk was low, he would call in the feed truck and in it would come. You got to have at least 24 inches of bunk space for cows, and that may be especially important for early lactation cows, and you may want to go to 30 inches if you listen to those crooks from Wisconsin at the vet school. You may want to make that 30 inches, no sorting going on, and this is something that once in a while I would do, and that is my high groups. If you go to the empty bunk, once in a while I would challenge them with an extra pound of dry matter and see if the cows would respond. Well, we're out of time. We're down to our last 2 minutes here. So in summary, let's go to Hutchins take-home messages. We have a quiz. So let's find out kind of where you are thinking right now. So polls are open. So come on, you Republicans, let's get on board here. You have 4 ways to group cows. By parity. You can pick that as your number 1 choice. Body condition score, that'd be your number 1 choice. Or milk yield, you only can pick one. You can't do all of the above. I'm not going to let you cheat on this one. Reproductive status, that could be very important on some herds. And in some cases, maybe health status. In other words, lame cows, cows that have contagious mastitis, for example, would be another way to group cows. So the poll is open. We're at 30 minutes. Steve, any comments?
They're off and running. Yes, this will be quite interesting to see how this one shakes out. I have my hunch, but I'll keep that quiet until the voting is done.
Well, Steve, we're going to ask you here in about 2 seconds which way you're going to vote here. Let's go ahead and close the polls. Steve, what are you going to vote?
I'm going to vote with the majority there, energy-corrected milk, actually.
Boy, you're an Obama man. I can see that from way back. He's an Obama man. I tell you, he just goes with the majority.
Well, he was from Kansas, too, you know. So.
Oh, that's right. Well,
or at least his mother was. Go ahead.
Let's not go where his dad was. We'll just leave it alone. We'll just leave that one alone. Yeah. Anyway, as Steve said, you can see nearly 60% say on milk yield as far as that goes. And so, Mike Allen, you just lost. You just lost at this stage of the game. So let's go to Hutchins. You heard Steve. Steve, any other comments you want to make? What about Hoards? What are you guys doing? Are you grouping out at Hoards?
Well, you know, we're a little complicated with 2 different breeds and some limitations on stall sizes because of the change in the breeds. But we really are pretty much of a 1 TMR operation with varying amounts to about 5 or 6 different groups.
I see. A neat comment. We'll follow up on that. He stole a little bit of my thunder as far as that goes at this point. But Steve, that's why the subscription to Hoard's Dairyman is modestly high, I assume, because you've got to pay for all that lost income between grouping cows. Oh, Jim Baltz just rolled his eyes and said, "Why do you do that, Hutchins?" Let's move on. Well, listen, let's give it a Hutchins look. Let's have a Hutchins look at some of those answers. Here we go, and they're biased. Number 1, I think pretty obvious. My first grouping, you're saying you're only going to give me 2 groups. I'm going to have a young cow group, and I'd put some of those timid Guernseys in that group, by the way, as well, and I'd have older cows. That'd be my first cut. You're only going to give me 2 groups. That's how I'm going to have to do it. What scares me is some of my facilities lock me out of this option. In other words, the facilities are 50-50, and I don't have 50% of my cows in many herds that are heifers unless you're expanding, of course. Then my next group I would add would be fat cow groups. Some of us who are somewhat portly would say a tall, dark, and handsome group, but anyway, a fat cow group. These are cows, our body condition score 3 1/4, and probably still have 100 days to go. This is the Mike Allen approach, screaming at us. Then if you're going to give me one more group, then I'm going to take my early and late lactation mature cows and split them based on such things as milk yield, days pregnant, those kind of factors as well. And then I'm going to have, if you give me the 4th group, it's going to be a fresh cow group, because I can do some pretty neat things on cow health, ingredients, additives at this point. Now, there are other ones we we can take a look at. They're listed at the bottom, and we'll go from there. If you go to a one group, Steve, that's exactly what you guys are doing out there at Hoard's Dairyman. You're simply got a one group here, and you're splitting cows up amongst different pens. And that could be due to reproduction, that could be due to parity, that could be due to somatic cell count, that could be due to staff count.
Yeah, stage of lactation has a lot to do with it in our case.
Okay, so so if you're only going to be a one group TMR, you can still do some grouping out there if the facilities allows, and that's exactly what Hoard's Dairyman is doing. Here you can see some numbers that reflect my biases at this stage of the game, and so here's the take-home messages. Steve, I'm not going to read them. I'll let the listeners read those at their leisure at this stage of the game. I think you've heard all these biases, but we've got questions coming up here pretty quickly, and we're out of time. And so questions, we'll get to this right now. And Steve, you may want to talk about this.
Yes. While you catch your breath, and before we get into those questions, Mike, we want to let our listeners know that the next webinar, and you talked about Victor Corber's work quite a bit, and he himself will be with us on February 11th, talking about some of these new dairy software tools that are available. Can do a lot of things for us, and the price is right, it looks like. I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Mike, for another great presentation. You did a great job talking about grouping strategies, gave us all a lot of food for thought, I think, and me an assignment to look into at the Hoard's Dairyman farm. Just want to remind the listeners again that we have all of this webinar in a few days will be archived along with all the previous ones that we've had. Just go to hoards.com and check on the webinar link, and you'll find all those archived webinars. We're up to 17,300 views of past webinars on the part of people out there looking to this as a source of information. Those of you that were with us today will get emailed a survey with 7 pretty quick, easy to answer questions that will actually give you a link back to the webinar. But this survey that you complete for us is very important to us to help us make sure that these webinars are meeting your needs. And for those of you that are new, this is a fun survey to do because you find out how other people are answering the questions just as soon as you respond to the questions, which is kind of cool. And obviously we appreciate your feedback on how we're doing with the webinars and what you would like to hear about in the future. Any suggestions you have would be greatly appreciated, and as Mike indicated today, we've been listening to you and planning accordingly, so we appreciate that. Mike, I guess we do have some questions, and are you ready to tackle those?
Yeah, we do, Steve, and they're excellent. In fact, we have one person who maybe tried to explain the Illinois data, so let's start, and we'll take them right as they come down, and we'll stay right on schedule here. Question is, if the Illinois cows got moved to a different group, they could have more than 24 hours of milk. Hey, how about that? Bingo. Good for you. Whoever that is gets a free cup of coffee next time I see you at a dairy meeting. So that's that could explain it. That different milking times and more milk in the udder. That's fantastic. Jim, did you would have thought of that? No, Jim wouldn't have thought about that. Number 2 question is an interesting comment, probably more than a question. How much work has there been done for temporary regroupings? And how much do they cost in terms of milk? And the examples that he's given us would be such as sorting to the palpation rail for herd check, or hoof trimming, or in other words, temporarily removing the animals from that from the environment. Boy, I think what a great question from our listener here. I think the question is, one of the palpation rails I saw in Illinois, they brought some TMR to the palpation rail or the area where the cows are going to be locked up. So they did have a chance to eat dry matter intake coming back from the milking parlor. This listener is spot on. I think he's from Minnesota, which surprises me a little bit. But anyway, certainly the idea of being away from the feed is critical, and that's why we see the overloading of the heifer pen and the high group pen. Is some of these cows just literally don't eat as much dry matter. They prefer to timidly back away or not eat when they should be eating, as far as that goes, and getting the job done. So anyway, that is the comment. Now, obviously, this now we're playing hardball here. That same person comes back and wants to talk about Illinois basketball ratings this week. But anyway, I think we're still number 12. I don't think we fall until tomorrow. So that'll take care of you crooks up in Minnesota. At this point, next question: what do you feel would be the minimum herd size to justify using the Wisconsin information? Boy, that's a neat question. You may want to save that for Victor for next month. I would argue, to me, it would, if I had 60 cows, I'd still run the program with my herd just to see what kind of specs would come with 1 group, 2 group, 3 group, 4 group. I think that'd be really interesting to take a look at and then put the economic numbers on it. So, honestly speaking, 60 cows might be too low, but I think if I had 100 cows, I'd be doing it. Now, obviously, you're not going to do 4 groups, but if you got 100 cows, and if that's my listener, you have 100 cows, do all 4 groups just to see what the economic impact is going to be, and also to see what the nutrient variation would be. And if my herd is running 25,000 pounds of milk, which is a Holstein herd, versus 20,000, which is the Illinois average, that number will look different. So I think it's a great tool to ask a lot of what ifs as far as that goes. Steve, another question. What is your opinion on a single group, a low group TMR, along with feed stations? I would assume this would be something like a robotic milker. It could be electronic grain feeder. We still have a lot of those out in the country. Will it get me? Will it get me the same savings? Jim's going to eliminate this one right now. I think it would be a great approach. I think it'd be a great approach. My guess, Hutchins' guess is, I think you'll have your cake and eat it both ways, as long as your cows will come out and eat the amount of feed that they need from the electronic grain feeder. I smile because we have another question coming up on robotic feeders here, that if you put too good of a ration out in the TMR bunk, then the cows are not wanting to go back and eating the grain in the feeder or come into the milking parlor. And so we really have to force the cow, to use electronic grain feeder. So if you do this, eyes wide open if you're going to try this. So interesting question. Steve, any you want to jump in on this one or not?
No, I don't really have much to shed there, but with increasing use of robots, really there's a lot of interest in those out there, and how we're gonna do this, use a partial TMR, so to speak. It's going to get interesting.
Yeah, it sure is. I would build that low group TMR perhaps to the herd average. So if there's some silly heifer or cow out there, or some Hoard's Dairyman Guernsey who says, you know what, that electronic grain feeder is a bunch of hooey, I'm just going to eat TMR because it tastes better, I like the corn size, I like the haylage quality in there, then I think you got to be careful. So I would be cautious building a low group TMR that may be like 50 pounds of milk and my herd's averaging 70. It would scare me. I would have you building the low group TMR probably at 70, unless there is a body condition and a breeding problem sitting in the herd, or it's a fairly low producing herd that you'd find in Minnesota, for example. We have to take care of these Minnesota crooks when we have a chance. Another quick question: with the adoption of robotics, how is feed bunk space affected? Some robotic companies claim less than 24 inches. I'd love to see the research. I wouldn't argue with them though, because literally these cows are going to come in 3 times a day. They're going to come in at different times, and therefore once they are in milk, they're going to eat their allocation of the robotic feeder. And if they're supposedly smart cows, they're going to go out to the feed bunk. And so therefore I probably would not need as many inches, because my cows aren't all going to come to the feed bunk at the same time with the same degree of appetite as far as that goes. So my guess is they're probably right. They are probably right from that aspect. I think I'd do some watching if I were doing it out there to see if there is any backup on the feed bunk as far as that goes, in terms of coming out there at 10 o'clock in the morning, discover all the holes are full. For some reason, they like to eat feed at 10 o'clock. That's when Rush Limbaugh comes on here, and I can see why cows would want to eat feed rather than listen to Rush Limbaugh, but we'll move on. Next question: how many days would you keep cows after calving before moving into the early group? What differences in the fresh cow group after calving, fiber and additives? Great question. Hutchins bias is coming very quickly. Dick Wallace has convinced me that once the cow is healthy, she is going to move into the early group. Could be as early as 5 or 6 days after calving. The Wisconsin researchers would suggest, with some of their data, putting him in right from the get-go. And we're just skipping that 5 to 10 to 14 to 21 day window of social interaction, just putting him right in the high group and going that direction, so we don't have that social interaction of messing up the fresh group and then the high group bringing these cows in. The advantage of bringing them in a little bit later is that you and I can find any sick cows. I was on a farm in Illinois years ago in which these cows developed a fairly significant uterine infection 10 to 15 days after calving, and by that time they had left the fresh cow group, and the only way you could find them is to smell them, and let me tell you, losing lots and lots of milk. What would we do? Can you put that back up for a second there, Jim, if you can retrieve that for me? He says, what about fresh group after calving? Usually most farmers will add, for example, 4 to 5 pounds of high-quality alfalfa hay to the fresh group to encourage them to eat the hay. If a fresh cow doesn't eat really 180 relative feed value of baled alfalfa hay, you really got a dumb cow, or you have a sick cow that has a very poor appetite as far as that goes. So I would add that fiber to it. I probably would certainly be looking at having my yeast culture, my bicarb, my buffer sitting in there. You might even have some of your choline products sitting in there, although that would probably go into the early lactation pen as well. But I would raise the fiber and probably a little more amino acid, because we know they're going to be short on lysine methionine because the microbes aren't getting as much dry matter at 7 days after calving as they will, say, 21 to 30 days after calving at this point. One last question, and we're right on schedule here, Steve. This is unbelievable. More and more dairy seem to be grossly overstocking. 125, 144% in parentheses. A very good dairyman stocks by total body weight. What do you think? Thus, lighter cows the same pen as with heavier cows. Scares the daylights out of me. Scares the daylights out of me. First of all, once he added, or she added, more light cow, thus more light cows the same pen, it would really bother me. Would really bother me at this point. Plus, the lighter cows are probably going to be less aggressive as far as that goes. So
I wonder if the overstocking rate is different for the thinner cows than it would be from the heavier cows, for example. That'd be an interesting thing to know in that case.
Yeah, Steve, it's great. It's a great comment. Now, I think I saw some work coming out of New York by Rick Grant. I think it was in Hoard's Dairyman, in which they were looking, no overstocking. I think Gordy Jones in his webinar also had it, 100% for first calf heifers and less than 100% for close-up and fresh cows and high-producing cows, 100%, and then they start bumping it up. A lot of us stop at 110 to 115%. And I know it's nice to sneak those extra cows in there, but I think Rick Grant's got some data. In fact, we may have Rick Grant back on sometime to kind of update kind of the new data that they've done out there at the Minard Institute. You may want to go back to his webinar back in 2011. I think that's right, is it not, Steve? You have to go to 2011. Yeah. And Steve, are they up there? Are they still up there?
Yes, they would be.
Okay, you can go back 2011 and listen to that. He's got some pretty neat data. So again, a good comment. That's really fascinating. That's one of the fun things about webinar. I have no idea how to answer this question. It's
with people overstocking, we all do it. One of the things that we look at here at our farm is pounds of milk per cow per stall, pounds of milk per stall rather than per cow. Or in our case, we actually calculate the pounds of fat and protein produced per stall. So that helps you adjust for your overstocking, the price of overstocking, if you will, so to speak. So that might have some application in this. Okay. But anyway, Mike, that's the end of the questions, it looks like.
Well, we have one more.
Oh, do we have another one? Okay,
yeah, Illinois has now been ranked 23rd, and let me tell you, that's the 23rd best team in the United States. It really is a sorry year for basketball in the United States. I'll turn it back to you, Steve. Thanks, guys.
All righty. I want to again thank Digistar for their sponsorship of today's webinar, and Mike, you again for a great presentation on grouping strategies. Very well done, very interesting, and we appreciate all of you out there for being with us. Remember that all of these are available on our archives, and we hope that you can be with us again about a month from now, on February 14th, when Dr. Vic Cabrera from the University of Wisconsin is going to be talking about new software tools that we can use in making some of these decisions that we all have to face day to day out there taking care of our cows, and which Mike talked about so well here this morning. So thanks again for all of your participation. Hope to have you with us again.